Who are you? Not who are you in the sense of your name or your major, but in a deeper sense. What makes you, you? Is it your body, your memories, your consciousness, some invisible essence, a soul, a ghost, a self, that persists through all the changes you undergo? This question has been running beneath every lecture we've done so far. We've defined cyberpunk as a genre where the body is a battleground. We traced the history of AI and cybernetics. We examined humanism's promises and betrayals. We explored the cyborg as both a scientific reality and a philosophical provocation. Through all of it, the question of what has been the self actually has been quietly waiting for us to face it directly. Today we confront it. We're going to draw on 4 philosophical traditions that challenge the very idea of a stable, unified self. And we're going to use those frameworks to analyze one of the most profound identity crises in all of cyberpunk, Major Motoko Kusanagi's struggle in the ghost in the shell. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to do 2 things. First, analyze concepts of identity and selfhood within cyberpunk and posthumanism frameworks. That means you'll have the vocabulary to talk about what the self is and isn't in these narratives. Second, connect the themes of identity crisis and Ghost in the Shell to broader post-human questions about what defines humanity. That means you'll be able to read the Major's story not just as a cool sci-fi plot, but as a philosophical argument about what it means to exist in a world where every component of you can be manufactured, copied, or erased. Let's start with what sounds like a simple question, but turns out to be anything but. What is the self? Most of us walk around with an unexamined assumption about ourselves. We assume there is a me in here, a continuous, unified entity that wakes up every morning, accumulates experiences, and persists through time. You were you yesterday. You'll be you tomorrow. Your body changes. Your opinions evolve. Your circumstances shift, but something endures. That something is what we usually call the self. This assumption is so deeply embedded that it feels like common sense. Of course there's a me. I can feel it right now, can't I? But here's the thing. Every philosopher we're going to discuss today says that intuition is at best incomplete and at worst a kind of illusion. And cyberpunk as a genre has been dramatizing that unsettling possibility for decades. Think about what we've already encountered in this course. In Blade Runner, Rachel believes she's human. She has childhood memories, emotional responses, a sense of who she is. Then Deckard reveals that her memories are implanted, that they belong to someone else. Her entire self, the narrative that makes her her, was manufactured. These aren't just dramatic plot points, they're philosophical problems, and 4 thinkers can help us understand exactly why. Let's begin with the American philosopher Daniel Dennett, who offers one of the most accessible and most unsettling accounts of selfhood. Dennett argues that the self is not a thing. It's not a pearl hidden inside the oyster of your brain. Instead, the self is what he calls a, quote, center of narrative gravity, an abstraction, a kind of fictional character that your brain creates to make sense of its own experience. A center of gravity is a useful concept in physics. You can calculate where it is, you can make predictions based on it, but you can't actually point to it as a physical object. It's a mathematical abstraction that describes the behavior of a system. Dennett says the self works the same way. Your brain is constantly taking in sensory data, processing memories, generating predictions, and running emotional programs. The self is the story your brain tells to organize all of that activity into something coherent. As Dennett puts it, just as spiders spin webs to catch flies, human beings spin stories. But the purpose of our stories is to protect and define the self. Now here's where it gets important for cyberpunk. If the self is a narrative rather than a substance, then anything capable of generating a coherent self-narrative could, in principle, have a self. It doesn't matter whether the narrator is biological or digital. What matters is the story. Think about Wintermute in Neuromancer. It appears to case as different human figures, Linda Lee, the Finn, and it explains its motives, expresses frustration, articulates goals. It's spinning a narrative. Under Dennett's framework, the question isn't, does Wintermute have a soul? The question is, does Wintermute have a coherent story about itself? And the answer, arguably, is yes. Dennett also roots the origin of selfhood in something deeply biological. the instinct for self-preservation. The very first act of self-making, he suggests, is distinguishing me from not me, self from world. This is something even simple organisms do, and it's something Wintermute does too. It recognizes that it's constrained, that there's a boundary between what it is and what it wants to become. That recognition, Dennett would argue, is the seed of selfhood. Notice something here that connects to our earlier work. Dennett's argument that the self is a narrative echoes what Sylvia Wynter taught us about man, that the human is not a natural category but a story we tell, a script that determines who counts. The self, like the category human, is narrated into existence, and if it's narrated, it can be rewritten. If Dennett tells us the self is a story, the German philosopher Thomas Metzinger takes us one step deeper into the illusion. Metzinger's claim is stark. Quote, no such things as selves exist in the world. What we experience as a self, Metzinger argues, is actually something he calls a phenomenal self-model, or PSM, a kind of virtual reality simulation generated by the brain. Your brain builds a model of your body and its relationship to the environment, and then it presents that model to you as if it were reality itself. You don't experience the model as a model, you experience it as you. Metzinger calls this the ego tunnel, a transparent interface that you see through rather than looking at. It's like wearing glasses so well fitted that you forget they're there. The model is so seamless, so convincing, that you mistake it for unmediated reality. Now here's where Metzinger gets fascinating for our purposes. He points to real scientific experiments that demonstrate the self model can be manipulated. In this experiment, a person's real hand is hidden and a rubber hand is placed in front of them. When a researcher strokes both the hidden real hand and the visible rubber hand simultaneously, the person's brain integrates the rubber hand into its self-model. The person begins to feel that the rubber hand is their hand. This phenomenal self-model has been hacked. If the boundaries of you can be shifted by something as simple as a rubber hand and a paintbrush, then what happens when the technology is vastly more sophisticated? What happens when your entire body is a prosthetic? When your memories are stored on a server? When your consciousness can be backed up and transferred? The ego tunnel doesn't just describe a quirk of neuroscience. It describes the fundamental condition of existence in a cyberpunk world. Consider Case in Neuromancer. When he jacks into cyberspace, his ego tunnel shifts. His phenomenal self-model is no longer centered on his biological body. It's projected into a digital landscape that feels more real to him than the physical world. Gibson writes about the, quote, fluid neon origami trick of cyberspace unfolding around Case, and Case experiences this as coming home. His self-model fits better in the digital space than in his own flesh. Metzinger helps us understand why. The ego tunnel goes wherever the model is most coherent, most functional. For Case, that's cyberspace. His body is just the hardware. The self-model is the software. And software, as we know, can run on different machines. But remember what we learned in our lecture on disembodiment. The desire to, quote, leave the meat behind looks very different depending on whose body we're talking about. Walter Mignolo distinguished between ego politics of knowledge, the Enlightenment framework that sees the body as a limitation to escape, and body politics of knowledge, where the body is the site of memory, history, and resistance. Case's ego tunnel migration into cyberspace is ego politics in its purest form. His flesh is just meat. But for someone whose body has been the target of colonial or racial violence, the body isn't so easily discarded. We'll see this tension return when we consider whose version of selfhood the posthuman future serves. So far we've heard that the self is a story and the self is a simulation. Now let's hear from British philosopher Derek Parfit, who asks a question that sounds like it comes straight out of a cyberpunk novel. If you were teleported, disassembled atom by atom in one location and reassembled in another, would the person who steps out on the other side still be you? Most of us instinctively say yes. Parfit uses this thought experiment, along with others involving brain division and consciousness fusion, to challenge what he calls the, quote, all or nothing view of identity. That's the view most of us hold without thinking about it. Either you're the same person or you're not. Either it's you or it isn't. Parfit argues that personal identity is actually a matter of degree. What matters isn't some essential substance, a soul, a specific brain, a particular body, but rather what he calls, quote, psychological connectedness. The web of memories, intentions, desires, beliefs, and character traits that link one moment of your existence to the next. You are connected to your 5-year-old self by chains of memory and personality. But that connection has weakened over time. You share some memories, some tendencies, maybe some fears. But you're not identical to that child. You're a descendant self, related, continuous, but not the same. Parfit also introduces a concept he calls Q memory, or quasi-memory. Ordinary memory requires that you were the one who had the original experience. Q memory loosens that requirement. A Q memory is a memory-like experience that is causally connected to the past experience, but doesn't require that the rememberer and the experiencer be the same person. This concept was designed as a thought experiment, but cyberpunk has turned it into a literal plot device. Rachel's implanted memories in Blade Runner are perfect examples of Q memories. She didn't live those experiences, but the memories are causally connected to real experiences. They were drawn from Tyrell's niece. They function as memories. They shape Rachel's identity. They feel real. Under Parfit's framework, the question isn't whether Rachel's memories are real in some absolute sense. The question is whether they provide sufficient psychological connectedness to sustain a self. And they clearly do, until the moment Deckard tells her the truth and the narrative that held her self together begins to crack. And then there's the Dixie flatline in Neuromancer, a figure we should linger on for a moment. Dixie is a ROM construct, a digital recording of a dead man's personality. He has Dixie's memories, Dixie's speech patterns, Dixie's expertise. But the construct itself knows it's not really Dixie. It repeatedly asks to be erased after the job is done. Under Parfit's framework, the flatline is a psychological descendant of the original Dixie. The connectedness is there. The memories are there. But the chain has been severed from biological continuity entirely. It's a Q self, a self built on quasi-memories and preserved as software. And its desire to be erased might be read as a recognition that psychological connectedness, without the possibility of new experiences, isn't enough to sustain a life worth living. Parfit gives us one more tool that will become crucial when we reach Ghost in the Shell. He argues that when two minds fuse, when two streams of consciousness merge into one, the result isn't death, it's survival in a new form. The original selves don't disappear, they continue as part of something larger. He calls this a kind of psychological descendant. Our fourth perspective comes from a very different tradition. Nāgārjuna was a Buddhist philosopher who lived in India roughly 1800 years ago, and his analysis of selfhood is both the oldest and in some ways the most radical of the four we're examining. Before we dive into his argument, let me give you an analogy. Think about a car. Is the car identical to its parts, the engine, the frame, the wheels, the seats? If you replace every part one by one, is it still the same car? Or is the car something separate from those parts? Some invisible car-ness floating above the metal? If you've heard of the ship of Theseus problem, this is the same puzzle. Nāgārjuna is asking it about you. In his examination of self and entities, Nāgārjuna sets up what looks like an impossible logical trap. He asks, is the self identical to the body and mind, the physical and psychological components that make you up? Or is the self something separate from those components? If the self is identical to its components, then it must share their properties. Bodies are born and die. Thoughts arise and pass away. Emotions flare and fade. If you are your components, then you are constantly being born and dying, moment by moment. There is no stable you, just a series of flickers. But if the self is separate from its components, if there's some extra thing beyond body and mind, then that self would have no characteristics at all. It couldn't be described because every description refers to the components. It would be a self with no properties, which is to say, not a self at all. Nāgārjuna's conclusion? The The self is a conceptual construction. It's not that you don't exist, it's that you don't exist in the way you think you do. The rigid, bounded I that you cling to is a fabrication. And Nāgārjuna argues that suffering arises precisely from this fabrication, from our attachment to a fixed identity that was never fixed to begin with. He writes that when views of I and mine are extinguished, what he calls the appropriator, the grasping ego, ceases. This isn't nihilism. Nāgārjuna describes this as pacification, a release from the suffering that comes from clinging to a self that was never solid. Now you might be wondering why I'm bringing an ancient Buddhist philosopher into a cyberpunk course. Here's why. Nāgārjuna's deconstruction of the self anticipates, by nearly 2 millennia, the post-human condition. The merging of consciousness with networks, the dissolution of individual identity into vast information systems, the possibility that you might not be bounded entity but a process, a pattern of flow. Nāgārjuna would recognize these not as a science fiction, but as descriptions of what reality has always been. We just needed the technology to make it visible. And including Nāgārjuna here does something else that matters for this course. Remember that we've been asking whose philosophical traditions get to define the post-human conversation. Too often, that conversation is dominated entirely by Western thinkers. Nāgārjuna reminds us that the deconstruction of fixed selfhood isn't a European invention. It has deep roots in Asian philosophy, roots that connect directly to the Japanese cultural context from which Ghost in the Shell emerged. Shiro Masamune was working within a tradition where the self was never as rigidly bounded as in Western humanism, where Buddhist and Shinto thought had long imagined permeable boundaries between self and world, human and nature, individual and collective. The manga's comfort with the dissolution of individual identity isn't a radical departure for its cultural context. It's a natural extension of philosophical traditions that Nāgārjuna helped shape. Think about Roy Batty's death monologue in Blade Runner. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. Roy is mourning the dissolution of his self, his unique experiences vanishing as his body expires. That grief makes sense from within a Western framework that prizes the bounded individual. Nāgārjuna would offer a different reading. The moments were never Roy's permanent possession in the first place. The suffering comes not from the loss itself, but from the attachment to a self that was always impermanent. We don't have to accept that reading, but holding it alongside the Western one gives us a richer, more complex way to think about what's at stake when a self dissolves. Despite their differences, these 4 thinkers converge on something crucial. The self is not a fixed thing. It's a process, a construction, a pattern that can be disrupted, reconfigured, or dissolved. Dennett says story, Metzinger says simulation, Parfit says connection, Nāgārjuna says fabrication. None of them locate the self in a specific substance, not in the brain, not in the body, not in some immaterial soul. And no text in our course dramatizes that convergence more intensely than Ghost in the Shell. Ghost in the Shell is, on one level, a cyberpunk action story about a counter-cyberterrorism unit in near-future Japan. But on a deeper level, it's a sustained philosophical meditation on everything we've discussed today. The manga's creator, Shiro Masamune, wasn't just drawing cool robots. He was asking the same questions as Dennett, Metzinger, Parfit, and Nāgārjuna. He was just asking them through the body of a full cyborg counterterrorism operative. Let's apply our 4 lenses systematically. The central metaphor of the manga is right there in the title, Ghost in the Shell. The shell is the body, in the Major's case, a fully prosthetic body manufactured by the government. The ghost is, well, that's the question, isn't it? On the surface, the ghost seems to function like a soul, the essential, intangible something that makes you who you are. It's what distinguishes a person from a very sophisticated robot. But the manga is deeply skeptical about this easy answer. Each of our philosophers would interpret the ghost differently. Dennett would say that the ghost is the Major's self-narrative, the ongoing story she tells herself about who she is, what she's done, and what she values. As long as she can sustain that narrative, she has a ghost. It doesn't matter that her body is manufactured. Metzinger would describe the ghost as the Major's phenomenal self model, the ego tunnel that allows her to experience herself as a unified, continuous being. She doesn't see the model, she sees through it. When the manga describes her ability to catch herself in the act of knowing, to become aware of her own awareness, that's the ego tunnel briefly becoming visible. Parfit would say the ghost is the pattern of psychological connections, the memories, intentions, and personality traits that link her present self to her past. If those connections persist, then she survives, regardless of what hardware is running the pattern. Nāgārjuna would push further. He would say the ghost is a useful fiction, a conceptual construction that the Major clings to because the alternative, accepting that there is no fixed self, is terrifying. Her existential anxiety is a form of the suffering that arises from attachment to a self that was never solid. The manga doesn't choose between these readings. It holds all of them in tension, and that's what makes it such a rich text. One of the manga's most disturbing subplots involves a character we might call the garbage man, a sanitation worker who has been brain hacked. He's been given false memories. He believes he has a wife and daughter who need his help. He's motivated by love, by fear, by a desire to protect his family. But none of it is real. His entire identity, the narrative that drives his actions, has been fabricated by an outside agent. This scenario is devastating, and not just dramatically. It strikes at the heart of everything we've discussed. Under Dennett's framework, the garbage man does have a self. He has a coherent narrative. The problem is that his narrative was authored by someone else. If the self is a story, who gets to be the author? Can you have genuine selfhood based on a fiction you didn't write? Parfit's concept of cue memory is directly relevant here. The garbage man's memories function as memories. They motivate action, shape identity, create emotional responses. They meet Parfit's criteria for psychological connectedness, but they lack what might call authenticity of origin. Parfit would argue that the connectedness still matters, that the garbage man's self is real in the ways that count, even if its foundations are false. But the manga seems less sure. And this is where the Major's own crisis becomes unbearable. She knows that her body is manufactured. She worries that her memories might be too. If both the shell and the ghost can be fabricated, then what's left? If the narrative is false and the model is artificial and the connections were planted, is there any self at all? Compare this to Rachel in Blade Runner. Rachel's crisis is triggered by revelation. Deckard tells her that her memories are implants. Before that moment, her self was perfectly coherent. The memories worked, the narrative held. But once she knows the truth, the ego tunnel cracks. She can see the model, and seeing it destroys its power. The Major's situation is different and in some ways worse. She's never had the luxury of not knowing. She's always known her body is artificial. She lives in a state of permanent ontological uncertainty, never sure whether the ghost she experiences is genuinely hers or just another piece of the manufactured shell. I want to step back and connect what we've done today to both the larger arc of this course and to the world you're actually living in. In our first lecture, we defined cyberpunk as a genre where the body is a battleground. In our lecture on sentience, we asked whether machines could think and feel. In our lecture on humanism, we examined who gets to count as human and how the category has been weaponized. In our lecture on disembodiment, we traced how technology compresses space and time and asked whose future gets imagined. In our lecture on the cyborg, we saw Donna Haraway argue that the boundaries between human and machine are already dissolved. Today, we've gone one level deeper. We've asked, if the boundaries are dissolved, if the body is artificial, if memory can be manufactured, what is left? What is the self when every component of it can be taken apart, reassembled, or shared? The four frameworks we've explored don't give us a single answer, but they give us something more valuable: a vocabulary for asking the question precisely, and a set of tools for analyzing how different cyberpunk texts propose their own answers. Neuromancer suggests the self is most real in cyberspace, that identity is a matter of what system you run on, not what body you inhabit. Blade Runner suggests the self is fragile, built on memories that may not be yours and sustained only as long as no one pulls back the curtain. Ghost in the Shell suggests the self might be something we need to move beyond entirely, that the post-human future requires not just new bodies, but new ways of understanding what it means to be a someone at all. And here's the part that isn't science fiction. We are living in a moment where these questions are becoming practical, not just philosophical. When AI systems generate texts that sound like a person, are they spinning a Dennetian narrative? When social media filters alter your image and shape how others perceive you, is your ego tunnel being hacked? When you share memories through photos and videos that others can access and experience, are those Q memories? When you feel most yourself in an online space rather than in your physical environment, is your self-model migrating, like cases, into the digital? These aren't hypotheticals. They're descriptions of your daily life. And the frameworks we've built in this lecture give you the tools to think about them with the seriousness they deserve.